A situation that comes to mind is when the great coach, soccer coach Ancelotti, was coaching his first game at Milan, which was an away game, and he determined that the bus would leave at 3 o'clock and no later. 3 o'clock came and every player was on the bus apart from the greatest player, Zinedine Zidane.
What do you do in that scenario, Tim?
Bus is gone. There's really no thoughts behind that. I mean, I think your greatest strength are your players. Once your players are empowered to the point where they start operating above the line and with standards and actions, and they start modeling the behaviors of what the expectations of the group are, and we just wouldn't find ourselves compromising a situation for any player, because
at any time during the season, Tim?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to answer that as honestly as I possibly can, because as you ask me that question, I'm going back in my Rolodex of events and environments that this has happened before. And I think that I've made concessions to certain kids, for instance, in certain situations where their resume, their history and their resume is impeccable. They don't make mistakes. So someone who makes a mistake based on other factors, once I understand what that factor is, then I can take into consideration why we would do it. But if it's a situation where it's behavior that's underneath the line, so to speak, that's caused that person to come up short, I don't really think the February versus June, or sitting in Nashville or sitting in Omaha, does it matter? I think if you have a problem at the end of the year or towards the end of the year, that's probably a foundational crack anyway. I just don't think it would come up. If it's an innocent mistake, then I think we can move through that.
Let me get your thoughts on how this plays out, because that's exactly what the coach wanted to do. Then something happens. How do you think about this?
And he said, "Okay, driver, go." And the team erupted, and a senior player came down the bus and said, "But coach, Zinedine is not here." And he said, "Well, I said 3 o'clock." He said, "But yes, for us, but Zinedine is not here." 5 minutes later, Zinedine arrived, strolled on the bus, smiled at everybody, sat down. The bus took off. The team won a very big game. Zinedine dominated the game and scored the only goal of the game. And, coaching isn't about purity. It's about doing the best you can within a context. And it's about the marriage of process and outcome. And coaches are judged on outcome. But you try and instigate the best process. And it often occurs to me that the higher the level you go, sometimes there is an I in team.
Thoughts?
I don't necessarily believe that. I'd rather win that game without Zinedine scoring that goal. I'd rather have someone else score that goal, to be honest with you, because I really think the strength for that moment and the strength for that year and the strength for the years after it are the fact that you stay true to the standards of what you're doing. And I think, you may have won the battle right there in a 1-0 game, but you don't necessarily win the war. People will remember that. Kids will remember that. Kids will move forward and say, "Well, I remember this. He waited for this one person, our best player, at this point." That's a year later. I just think that sticking to convictions, sticking to what's important, sticking to the team values is the most important thing. And I have not been faced personally with anything like that before. But how would I react? I can tell you how I'd react. The bus would be moving. It would be going forward. Zinedine would not be on that bus. And we would try to find a way to win that game without him. And if we did, you would be giving more strength to your program at that point and for the years after because of what you did.
So let's take this a step deeper. Tim, I want to show you one more clip.
Players in the team understand what helps them win. And there's a certain amount of plasticity in players' thinking. So, for example, Rodman playing for the Chicago Bulls required the rest of the team to understand Phil Jackson's phrase, any family can manage a backwards walking member. And I think that sometimes you can breach the conventional standard, but I do think it needs explaining, and it needs some collaboration with the rest of the players. And I think that the sooner coaches can move to adult relationships with players, the more those situations will be dealt with in a mature way.
Tim?
Yeah, I mean, what do you want to know from that?
I love it, man. You're such a baller, dude. I want to know what you think when you watch that clip.
Well, you're talking about Phil Jackson, and you're talking about one very unique individual on a championship team that does something very, very well, and that's he helps the team win. I think his uniqueness, and I'm talking about Dennis Rodman, and I've never spent 5 seconds in that locker room or on that team, so I don't know this for sure. I'm probably like the many people who during COVID every Sunday night was locked into the Michael Jordan documentary. But what I think of Dennis Rodman is the only thing that makes him unique is his appearance. But his appearance is external. What the other players know and what the people inside of that organization know is the internal side of Dennis Rodman. They understand the person of who he is. So I think we've had players like that before. I think that my wife would tell you that my pliability as a coach has continued to get better through the years because of my ability to bend, my ability to allow certain things that I didn't necessarily see as a standard at the beginning, whether it be jewelry around campus, whether it be hair a certain way, and so on. And I really feel like being a step parent has been helpful in that regard too, because I remember my wife saying to me immediately, and I'm maybe leaving the subject a little bit, but not. She said to me before I married her, she said, just remember this, kids will disappoint, and they disappoint not because they're trying to disappoint you, but they do it because of their innocence. And it's not because they don't care. It's not because they don't love you. They just will. And that always stuck with me because kids do disappoint. And I think you have to honor, and I think you have to respect their innocent actions and their personalities for who they are. And then it becomes a source of blending. And I think personally, my abilities have allowed more different individuals to come inside of this program and blend their personalities, much like a Dennis Rodman, into the standards of the program and be just fine.
So often we see coaches go below the line and how they address that by becoming very emotional. And it makes me think of something that Jeremy Foley had on his truck. And this was the license plate, and it stood for just get it done. And he said it was very symbolic on how he was early in his career, that he would just run over anybody that was in his way. Could you relate to that at all as a young coach, Tim?
As a young coach, potentially, yes. As a coach now that's close to 60, no.
When did the shift occur?
Well, I think the shift occurs when we all age. I just think when we start maturing, when we start becoming more aware of ourselves, when we start becoming more comfortable with what we're doing, then we start to kind of focus in on the areas that are more important. You get beyond the outcomes, you get beyond the scoreboard. But
Tim, can I break off on that point just for a second? So you say get beyond the scoreboard. Can I take that quote and apply it to something that Billy Donovan said?
If you do win a championship or you do, accomplish whatever dream or goal it is, what happens when you're 10, 15, 20, 30 years removed from that happening? Do you just stop your life and say, okay, I did it, now I can just relax and do nothing? You're not going to do that.
You're on the other side of a championship. How do you hear what Billy's saying?
I just look at it as a championship, as a time. I look at it as a wedding. I look at it as a ceremony. I look at it as a part of our life that came and went, and it was a great moment at that time. But I just think that, as long as your heart is beating and you're passionate about what you're doing, then you're creating moments every day of your life. And I don't really think because you get a gold trophy that it sustains you, or it defines what you're doing. That was for me something that, now it happened, and I'm glad it happened, obviously. And we got to do it a couple of times, but I'm not going to sit here and tell you that. I guess when you hadn't done it and then you do it, you understand that, okay, life didn't change. Nothing happened outside of the culmination of winning a final game. But you really, what you want to do is you want to jump right back into life again, and start to center yourself to where life becomes normal again. That to me was, and the point I think I've raised with you a couple of times, is the centering piece of life is, with celebration, exuberation, and devastation, which could be grief. They're both so on either end of the spectrum that they're both rather uncomfortable, to be honest with you, especially grief. But the celebratory piece is too, because after a while you want to say, okay, let's just move on with life. Let's get back to what we do every day, and try to jump back into some normalcy. So I would tell you that in terms of winning and losing and high moments and low moments, it really is your ability just to find your center point of life of comfort, to where you enjoy what you're doing, and trying to center yourself in what you're doing to better the environment that you're in, and to help the people that are in your environment grow to become better as well.
How about this? This is something that Jeremy Foley said to me. He has a box full of all the championship rings that he's won in all the different sports, and he looked at them, and he obviously he's not married and he doesn't have any kids. He asked himself, what happens to these when I die? And he said that it was a really eerie feeling that washed over him. And it starts to get to think about how people can overvalue that gold. And that leads us into Billy's last point.
It was amazing. I talked to a couple coaches, and I have to get to a Final Four. I can't get to a Final Four. And they got to a Final Four. And, don't win the national championship. And I said, listen, it's not going to stop, because if you do win the national championship, I got to do it again. And then if it's like, now I got to do it again. Now I got to do it. And it just doesn't stop, because what happens is you have to look at yourself and say, okay, like, why do I need this all the time for me feeling good about myself, or my own personal approval, or to build me up to make me feel better about myself?
And the thing I would challenge everybody on this coaching call to think about is, how often do people, maybe yourself, certainly people around you, leverage the achievements to make them feel good internally? And Tim, I know that you mentor a lot of coaches that have worked for you and some beyond. As you hear what Billy's saying, does that resonate with you and some of the conversations you're having with them?
Yeah, I think it's going back to the centering piece and just looking at the things that really matter. I mean, when I see those rings, what do I do with them? I mean, my rings are in my underwear drawer, underneath my underwear, so I never see them. The only ring that matters is the $25 ring that Maggie got me, and I told her, don't spend much money on it, because it's going to mean the same thing. It's all about the experience. It's all about the environment that you create in order to get the experience. That's it. If you happen to do a special thing because the environment was right, and you've created the right experience for the people inside of it, staff, players, everyone, then that's great. Then you have a great celebratory moment. But the celebratory moment is never going to define the level of the team that you developed, whether it was a good team, whether it was a great team, whether it was a legacy team. And I think when you develop a legacy team, legacy doesn't necessarily mean you won a national championship or you won a world championship or you finished the season winning the last game. It just means that you develop something that could be left behind for the next group of players who are going to play. And the players who are moving forward are going to take something with them that they gained from that program that will encourage something that they do inside of their own family, inside of their own business, or inside of their own team as they move forward. And I really think at the end of it, and you asked me earlier about now at this age, those are the thoughts that go through my mind as we go through this experience. You say, well, is winning important? Yes, there's importance to it. But what's more important is creating the environment and the experience for the kids. If your thought process and your energies are pointed in that direction, then you stand to create a positive you stand to create positive harmony inside of the program, so that the kids will be comfortable enough in order to create good behaviors. And those good behaviors, whether they're physical or mental or social, they'll represent your program in the way that you want them to.